Good afternoon. Welcome everyone to this INSS conference on Israel-Lebanon relations through the prism of the maritime border. I'm Sarah Foyer. I'm a fellow here at the INSS, and it's my pleasure to get to moderate what I think is going to be a really interesting session. Here at the INSS, one of the goals of the Institute is to bring research and analysis to bear on pressing national security questions for Israel. And I think what you're going to see today is a very interesting combination of practitioners, people who have been involved in the latest round of maritime border negotiations between Israel and Lebanon, as well as outside independent researchers and analysts weighing in on the question. So because of the time that we have together, I don't want to take up too much more. I'm going to start by turning to retired Lieutenant Colonel and former Deputy National Security Advisor, Orna Mizrahi. She's a senior fellow here at the INSS. Orna, perhaps start us out, give us just a few words of background on Israel-Lebanon relations, and perhaps some of the internal Lebanese dynamics that have to bear on this question of the border negotiations. Orna.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. So I'll start with some observation on Israel-Lebanese relations and say that, and I'll open with the statement that maybe will sound strange to some in the audience, and say that Israel has no real dispute with the state of Lebanon. And it's based on my assumption that Lebanon is not just Hezbollah. It's more complicated than that. The reasons for the military conflicts between the two countries in the past, as today, stemmed from the presence in Lebanon of foreign terrorist organizations hostile to Israel. The first Lebanon war in 1982 broke out because of the Palestinian presence in Lebanon. PLO that settled in Lebanon and initiated terror acts against Israel. In the second Lebanon war in 2006, as today, it was Hezbollah, which represents only part of the Lebanese population and is Iran's main proxy in the region, and an Iranian base on the northern border of Israel. The military capabilities of Hezbollah today pose a significant threat to Israel, and actually the organization poses the most serious conventional threat to Israel at present. Beyond the military conflict arising from the existence of Hezbollah and the threats it creates for both Lebanon and Israel, there are only few disputes between Israel and Lebanon, and I think that they can be solved quite easily. Of course, the mapping of the land and sea border, the regulation of the EEZ, the exclusive economic zone for production of energy. There is also the issue of the Palestinians refugees, that today they are fewer than they were before, and it can be solved. And also reaching an agreement on shared water sources and economic cooperation, etc., etc. But it is true that today part of the population in Lebanon sees Israel as an enemy and as negative attitude towards Israel. And I think this is mainly due to two reasons. The first one is the great destruction and suffering caused by the wars with Israel to the Lebanese population. But you can't blame Israel, just Israel, for that. And the second one is the cognitive campaign waged by Hezbollah against Israel, which is presenting the organization as the defender of Lebanon and Israel as the enemy and the great threat to Lebanon. And this cognitive campaign influences the population in Lebanon. But as I said before, Lebanon is not just Hezbollah. And there are several political groups, particularly among the Christians and also the Sunnis, who have a different agenda and attitude toward Israel, and some of them even recognize the benefit of peace with Israel. However, in my opinion, and I think it's shared by others in Israel and in Lebanon, had it not been for Hezbollah's presence and influence in Lebanon, it would have been easy to achieve and understanding between the two countries, and possibly reach even a peace agreement, as Israel has with its other neighbors, Egypt and Jordan. And this, of course, will strengthen the regional stability and prosperity. But today, due to Hezbollah's dominant position in Lebanon and its hostility towards Israel, it seems that this is impossible. So now for the few observations about the internal situation in Lebanon and the implication on the issue of marking the maritime borders. I think there is no doubt that the current difficult situation in Lebanon has an impact on the maritime border negotiations. This is mainly due to the economic collapse, the worst since the end of the Second Civil War in Lebanon, and the deep political crisis in which Lebanon finds itself, as well as the implication of the corona pandemic and the terrible explosion at the port of Beirut last August. The economic collapse, as well as the American pressure, were among the factors that pushed the government, including Hezbollah, to enter into the negotiations with Israel, because of the prospects of economic gain in favor of Lebanon, even if it is for the long range and not for the near future. Regarding the border marking negotiation, there are a number of obstacles arising from current internal situation in Lebanon. The first one is the inherent conflicts and power struggles among the corrupt political elite in Lebanon that cares more about its own interests than the interests of the Lebanese people. And moreover, since August 2020, there is a paralyzed transitional taker government in Lebanon. The corrupt ruling elite of all sects fails to agree on the new composition of the composition of a new government. So the decision-making system is paralyzed. And it seems that at this point, this is the main reason for the lack of progress in negotiations. But we can't ignore Hezbollah. And there is Hezbollah, which is not interested in normalizing the relations with Israel. The organization is a disruptive factor because the negotiations with Israel contradict its strategy vis-à-vis Israel and stands against its claims that Israel poses a threat to Lebanon. But it seems that Hezbollah agreed to open the negotiations due to the internal distress in Lebanon and the pressure exerted on it. And it's true that at present it is observing the negotiation and not interfering. But we have to see how it's going to end if there is going to be a real progress in the discussion with Israel, and it is going to resist to any real achievement. So to sum up this part, I'll say that the negotiations on the maritime borders are creating opportunity for change in the Israeli-Lebanese relations. So let's go on and see, and I'll stop here and give my colleague the opportunity to present the issue. Please.
Great, thanks, Elena. So we're now going to turn to the leading members of the Israeli delegation to the negotiations. We're going to hear from Udi Adiri, who's the Director General of Israel's Ministry of Energy and who is leading the delegation. We will then hear from Dr. Heinz Srebro, former Director General of the Survey of Israel. He's an engineer and has been a leading figure in international land and maritime boundary delimitations and demarcations. And then finally, we'll hear in the delegation from Amit Hoyman. He's the director of the International Law Department at the Office of the Legal Advisor to the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And he, as I said, is also a member of the delegation to the negotiations. Udi.
So good afternoon, and thank the INSS for hosting us and hosting this event today. So before me and my colleagues Amit and Chaim would present the Israeli position regarding the maritime boundary with Lebanon, we should first explain briefly what is a maritime boundary and why it's so important to define one. So a maritime boundary defines the offshore border between countries. It starts from the point where the water meets the shore, crosses the territorial water into the exclusive economic zone, the EEZ, runs for 370 kilometers or until it meets a third country, in our case, Cyprus. So unlike territorial water, the EEZ does not provide one with the territorial rights, but rather with the exclusive right to explore and to extract natural resources from the area. In our case, mainly natural gas. This is the main driver and motivator to demarcate the maritime boundary. So the last decade was really a revolutionary time in that aspect. Time in which Israel has fulfilled some of its potential while developing first Tamar gas field, afterwards the Leviathan gas field, and during the last 3 years also Karish and Tanin, where the subsea completion is already completed, and the field is expected to be connected to the Israeli grid very soon, probably at the beginning of 2022. Those procedures were the fulfilling of the potential involved investments of over $10 billion in the last decade, saving nearly $30 billion in cost of energy for the state of Israel, and creating a sustainable source of income for the Israeli government. But it's not only Israel. During that time, Egypt has also developed its gas fields, and Cyprus is soon going to develop its first gas field in the next few years. Those discoveries also strengthen the ties between the countries in the region, Israel, Cyprus, Egypt, and others, and the neighbors actually were collaborating in monetizing the gas in the region. So this is the story of this is why the EEZ is so relevant in the region and what happened in the last decade. According to surveys carried out in the region, some of that gas might exist also in the economical exclusive zone of Lebanon. Lebanon has not yet drilled or explored any of its potential and actually has no agreements at all regarding its economic exclusive zone with any of its neighbor countries. That is despite the fact that already in 2007, Cyprus and Lebanon reached an agreement regarding its maritime boundary, agreement that was signed by both countries but was not ratified by the Lebanese government, probably because of pressure by a third country. The agreement created the boundary points that later on were the base for the line Israel submitted to UN as a maritime boundary with Lebanon. My colleague Chaim will elaborate on this point. In 2010, Lebanon submitted a new line to UN referring its maritime boundary with Israel, a line that reaches maritime border with Cyprus in point 23, about 17 kilometers south of point 1, previously agreed by Lebanon in 2007. So I think you can see, now on the map, you can see the two lines. The blue line is based on point 1, the point which Lebanon and Cyprus agreed upon. The blue line reflects the line that Israel submitted to UN in 2010, and the green line is the line that Lebanon has submitted to UN also in 2010. So the triangle being created between those 2 points, the one marked by Lebanon in its agreement with Cyprus, then adopted by Israel, and the one Lebanon submitted to the United Nations in 2010, this area is well known as the disputed area between the countries, known in the region, known in the world, and by the way, also in the official publication by the Lebanese government that we saw recently described as the disputed area. So Israel came to the negotiations in order to solve the dispute, to find an equitable solution to the overlapping area. The Israeli position is based on 3 main pillars. The first is international law, defining the ways in which maritime border between neighbor countries should be demarcated, implemented in many rulings of international tribunals. My colleague Amit will soon elaborate on this point. Second, the second pillar of the Israeli position represents stability. Stability vis-a-vis agreements that were signed in the region, as well as economic activity in the region. By the way, stability by itself is also an important concept in the international law. Chaim will share with us his knowledge as well as personal experience on this aspect. The third pillar of the Israeli position is well established in the historical documentation, especially regarding the starting point of the demarcation. Altogether, these principles define an equitable solution to the conflict. While the Israeli position is well rooted, still negotiations are needed in order to solve the disputed area we just saw. But despite 8 months of talks, meaningful negotiation haven't even started. Since Lebanon, unfortunately, started the talks by presenting a new line that runs deep southern to the one submitted by Lebanon to United Nations, actually tripling the disputed area between the two countries. Now, lines are easy to be created. If we take an equitable solution that will not take into account the principle of stability in the region, it could lead to a line that reaches much northern to point 1, doubling the disputed area to the north and increasing Israeli economical water. For example, if you take point 2, that you can see in the map here, point 2 between Lebanon and Cyprus, if we take a line from the starting point to point 2, you can get a very equitable solution that will increase Israel rights, but will not reflect any concept of stability in the region. So, actually, the Lebanese created that line ignoring 4 fundamental points. And I'm referring to the new line that they have presented in the negotiation. So they were ignoring 4 fundamental points. First of all, they were ignoring point 1, previously identified by Lebanon and Cyprus as the trilateral border. Second, they were ignoring point 23, also submitted by Lebanon to United Nations as the end of the maritime boundary between Lebanon and Israel. But more important, they were ignoring 2 very important concepts. First of all, ignoring the Tchelet Island as a valid point for calculating the border line. That's in contradiction to international practice, as Amit will show. But it is also in contradiction to Lebanon's position in the past, and even to some extent to Lebanon's position today, and Amit will elaborate about that issue. The fourth point is that Lebanon did not use the common practice to define the starting point in case that the international land border is not agreed, such as the case between Israel and Lebanon. And there are practices to do that, and they were ignored by Lebanon, but also they ignored the strong historical documentation that was presented by Israel, and we'll share it with you today, I think, for the first time publicly. So those points will be elaborated by Amit and by Chaim. But in our case, the context is even more important than all the details. Unlike other conflicts, the dispute between Lebanon and Israel, other conflicts and disputes, this one has a very, very small territorial dimension, but rather an economical one. But the important issue is that economical dimension has also an expiration date. Expiration date that is coming closer and closer as climate change becomes the most important battle of humanity. According to energy experts and organizations such as the IEA and others, gas that will not be explored and produced in the next few years might probably stay in the ground forever, making this entire exercise almost irrelevant. So time is of an essence. Time to find a solution that will enable both countries to enjoy the potential that probably exists in a reservoir located partially in the disputed area. Otherwise, that gas will probably stay there forever. Hi, please.
Okay. Good evening. Many thanks for inviting me to share with you this evening as the person who has the privilege of actually delimiting all the agreed international boundaries of Israel on land and in the sea. I apologize for using paper because I've been asked to squeeze 2.5 hours of presentation into 10 minutes. Now, an international boundary on land and in the sea should be defined and agreed upon by the two relevant states. The UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, 1982, UNCLOS, says in Articles 74 and 83 that the delimitation of the exclusive economic zone and the continental shelf should be effected on the basis of international law in order to achieve an equitable solution. The International Court of Justice, ICJ, stated in its decision regarding the Cambodia-Thailand boundary case in 1962 that the primary object in the establishment of a boundary between two states is to achieve stability and finality, which is impossible to achieve if the boundary line at any moment and on the basis of a continuously available process be called in question. These two principles and objects, equitability and stability, guided us when delimiting the maritime boundaries with Jordan and with Cyprus. I had the privilege to delimit in 1996 the territorial sea boundary in the Red Sea with my Jordanian colleague, and to delimit in August 2010 the EEZ maritime boundary line with my Cypriot colleague. Both delimitations followed UNCLOS guidelines. The delimitations in the territorial sea, where states have full sovereignty, followed Article 15 regarding median and equidistance lines. The delimitation in the EEZ, exclusive economic zone, where states have limited rights up to a maximum distance of 370 kilometers from the coastline, as actually explained to you by Director General Adiri, followed Article 74 in order to achieve an equitable solution. When delimiting the maritime boundary with Cyprus, the Cypriots had introduced the results of their research, conducted years before our negotiations, following provisions of the UN Convention and the guidelines of the International Hydrographic Organization. Cyprus is party to both, while Israel is not party to UNCLOS, but accepts certain provisions of it as customary law. Additional references of Cyprus were their 2003 Cyprus-Egypt maritime delimitation, their 2007 Cyprus-Lebanon maritime delimitation, and their hydrocarbon licensing round dated February 2007. Our preliminary check found that these maritime lines, including the relevant 3 points, Cyprus, Egypt, Israel, and Cyprus, Lebanon, Israel, delimited by Cyprus and included in the delimitation agreements, following UNCLOS provisions and IHO guidelines, fit the Israeli computations and achieve equitable solutions as required by UNCLOS Article 74. Beyond that, we have looked for a solution that provides international stability in the region, which is, according to ICJ, a primary object of international boundary delimitations. Therefore, we have agreed with Cyprus to adopt the edge points of the delimited lines with Egypt and Lebanon to be common 3 points with Israel, and thus to maintain the existing stability since 2003 and 2007 between the relevant states. By adopting these lines and points, achieving equitability as required by UNCLOS and maintaining stability, which is the primary object according to ICJ, we, the State of Israel, have contributed our share to the stability of the region. After the signing, you can see on the slide, you can see actually the three delimitation agreements to the left, the 2003 delimitation agreement between Egypt and Cyprus. On the right side, the 2007 delimitation agreement between Cyprus and Lebanon, and in the center, the delimitation agreement between Cyprus and Israel in 2010, connected to both delimitations and actually providing a continuous line which supplies stability in this region. After the signing of Israel-Cyprus delimited line, we were surprised by the Lebanese chain of changes in its positions regarding the maritime boundary delimitation in the years 2010 and 2011, and even last year, in a way that undermines stability that is required regarding international boundaries and international relations. Unfortunately, during almost 80 years of its existence, Lebanon has not finalized any of its international boundaries with its neighbors, on land or in the sea. Fortunately, this will change, inshallah. The Israeli position stands on the ground of international law, following the principle of stability, preserving consistency of its positions regarding its agreed international boundaries with its neighbors, on land and in the sea. Following an acceptance of the joint trade point agreed between Lebanon and Cyprus in 2007 and between Cyprus and Israel in 2010, which achieves equitability and maintains stability, Israel and Lebanon have to delimit a line in the sea connecting the tree point with the point of origin of the maritime boundary, maritime delimitation line on the coastline. This should be agreed by the two states. The definition of the point on the coastline can be based on the international mandatory boundary agreed by Great Britain and France in March 1923, and the agreement about the boundary between Lebanon and Palestine at that time, Lebanon and Israel today. The terminus point of the international mandatory boundary line on the coastline was marked only on one large-scale official 1/2000 map during the time of the British mandate. This map was produced in May 1923 officially by the British authorities in order to construct a terminal, a complex of a terminal in Ras Al Nakura, yes, for crossing the boundary between the British area in the south and the French area in the north. Just 2 months after the agreement about the boundary itself, so it was very close. Now, on this map, one can find the boundary line actually running westward up to the sea, and in addition to that, you can find the French post and the British post, boundary posts. We will see it soon. Yes, now we can see it. You see the northern diagonal actually line, which is actually the boundary line. It's written there, a boundary line. Until it meets the sea, you can see the word sea on the left side. And inside you can find the French post and the British post. So actually this point, which is marked on the map, can serve both Israel and Lebanon in order to define the point of origin of the delimitation line. Now, after we have the first point and the last point of the delimited line, actually we have to delimit the line between them. In order to delimit the line between them, we have to follow international law, which actually defines certain methods based on the coastline. Now, the relevant coastline of the two states, according to UNCLOS, includes islands, islets, and protruding reefs as long as they are located inside the territorial zone. An extra weight is given if such features are part of the coastal environment, like Fringing Islands. Israel has such chain of islands, as can be seen on the bathymetric map that is presented just now. You can see that the area close to the coastline is very shallow, and you can see the islands actually protruding from this area, and these islands are very close to the coastline, about half a mile from the coastline. The materials of the islands, the composition of the materials, the structure of it is the same as the rocks along the shoreline, on land. Actually, it is part of the land, part of the coast. These are fringing islands. You can see to the left over the blue area where the water drops, the slope is very steep over there. Now, these islands, as I said, are very close to the coastline, while the Lebanese islands that were taken by Lebanon in order to delimit their delimitation lines with Cyprus and Syria are far more than the Israeli islands, and up to 10 kilometers and even more if we refer to the Ramkin Island. The Lebanese islands are not fringing the coast, while the Israeli islands are definitely fringing the coastline. Now, to sum up, as we agree on the relevant principles of international law, like the achievement of equitability, and if there is the will which enables compromise regarding small details, an agreement is doable, but under a big condition. Stability and consistency are a basic requirement. Since it is a joint agreement, mutual confidence is critical. There is no use if a party questions agreed delimitations continuously, like in the case of the Lebanon-Cyprus EEZ agreement, and turns it into kalam fadi. Thank you.
Thank you, Chaim.
Thank you, and first I would like to join Udi by thanking the INS for organizing this conference, and I'm very happy to participate here. Delimiting a maritime boundary is really a quite complex matter that involves geographical, geological, as well as legal aspects. In the interest of time, I will focus only on two of the issues that are relevant for these negotiations, and I will try to explain the legal basis for the Israeli line that we submitted to the UN and that was presented by Udi, our head of delegation. So I will focus on the delimitations starting point. And the second point I will touch on is islands and their relevance to maritime delimitation, and in particular the Israeli Tchelet Island, which you've heard already by now. I will also briefly mention, as much as time allows, some of the inconsistencies that we've seen in the Lebanese position in the past months. So at the outset, I will very briefly point out that Israel is not party to the main convention in this field, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. So it is not bound to it, while we do accept that certain provisions do reflect customary international law. I should mention that the principles that are set forth in the convention are in any case rather general in nature, and it is essentially a task up for the two states to agree how to draw up their maritime boundary. In addition, I will say that there are quite a large number of important decisions in recent years that were given by international courts, for example, the International Court of Justice, which serve also as very important guiding examples on how to resolve, according to international law, the issues that come up in our negotiations. So now I will turn to first to the maritime starting point. In simple terms, in order to establish the limitation line between two states, one of the most important determinations is where the line begins. Now, usually this is actually the easy part, because the most basic principle in this regard is that a maritime boundary between two adjacent states starts where the land boundary ends. This would typically be located where the land boundary meets the water at low tide. However, in the Middle East, like in the Middle East, nothing is easy. And since Israel and Lebanon do not have an agreed land boundary, we do have one-sided blue line demarcated by the UN and, of course, armistice agreements in the past, but we do not have an agreed land border. So we have a challenge here. In particular, since both sides claim a different starting point, and in order to solve it, we actually would have to go into the land boundary negotiations. This is made exceptionally complicated given our agreed upon framework for the negotiations. And to explain this, I will just say that before we commenced with the maritime negotiations in past October, during almost 3 years, we were negotiating under US mediation just on how to actually negotiate our boundary. And so the framework on which both sides eventually agreed concerns only the delimitation of a maritime boundary. And so the mandate that we have for these negotiations is limited to maritime issues alone, and we cannot discuss actually anything that would have implications for future negotiations or that would in any way prejudice our future positions on it. But there are also some good news. We are not the first ones to face this issue, and in fact there are quite a few countries that have delimited their maritime boundary successfully without having previously agreed on a land border. And this calls for a pragmatic approach. Indeed, we see different options. One, for example, could be to start the delimitation of the maritime boundary, not where the land boundary actually ends, but a little bit further out to sea, and so to skip over competing sovereignty claims close to the shore. This was done, for example, in one of a very famous case between the United States and Canada. In another case between Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, the parties also, they had an agreement actually on a land boundary. You can see here the black line is their agreed land boundary, but the land boundary finished at BP 55, so it did not reach quite the water, and it stopped a few hundred meters just before reaching the water. So they had no agreement on how to connect this point. At the tribunal, what it did, it simply took the general line that connect 54 to 55 and extended it in the same direction until it hit the sea, and set this as a starting point. These are the dotted points that you can see on the slide. Now, these precedents illustrate that it is indeed possible to draw up and agree upon a maritime boundary in situations where the land boundary was not previously agreed, or where there are outstanding issues, for example, sovereignty disputes close to the land boundary. And since similar issues arise between Israel and Lebanon in our delimitation, we have suggested ways to reach the maritime starting point that would correspond with the approaches that I described just now. All these methods lead north to the Israeli starting point, and we believe that, however, we do believe that this is an issue that can be resolved fairly easily. The second issue I will touch upon is the question of islands and their relevance to maritime delimitation. This relates to the significance that must be accorded to the Israeli island of Tchelet. You can see it here on the slide. So what we see is actually the northern coast of Israel, Rosh Hanikra at the top, and along the red arrow, you can see very closely to the shore there is a group of the Rosh Hanikra island group. It includes the Tchelet one, which is the most northern one. After there are Shachaf, Nachlieli, Arziv, and quite a few others. And so these are, as I mentioned, the Rosh Hanikra island group. In general, after having a starting point, the maritime boundary is drawn with reference to the coastal configuration of both relevant states. One such common option is to use the equidistance method, and I try to simplify it. This means that there is basically a maritime boundary on which a line on which every point is the same distance from both coasts. So basically it's triangles that create a line. And of course, islands can play a very important role in this process and will therefore often affect the course of a maritime boundary. Now, based on international law, as applied in many cases decided by international tribunals, one can draw a very clear distinction between the effect of different types of islands on fixing the maritime delimitation, and I'll explain what I mean. The first category relates to remote islands that are very far from the relevant mainland coast, and in such cases, the courts and tribunals often give them limited weight and sometimes even disregard them for the purpose of drawing the maritime boundary. But on the other hand, the second category relates to cases where we have what we call fringing islands, or a cluster of islands located very close to the mainland coast and in line with its general direction, and these are recognized in jurisprudence as fringing islands or coastal islands. And as such, they have always been given full effect in the delimitation of the boundary, no matter what the circumstances were. And in other words, islands that form part of the general coastal configuration and are not separated from the mainland or located far out at sea have always fully been taken into account in delimiting a maritime boundary between the two states. Now, in the Israeli-Lebanese case, this comes up in relation to the Tchelet Island. As you've seen, it clearly shows that they are fringing islands within the meaning of the jurisprudence, and you could just see that on the map that you've seen before. So it is located in the northern part of the Israeli coast, vicinity of Rosh Hanikra, only about half a mile off the coast with Israeli territorial, within the Israeli territorial water, and clearly forming an integral part of the Israeli mainland and belonging part of the group of islands. In fact, it is so close to the shore that you could swim there. I myself am perhaps too lazy for that, but if you want to try that, you can do that. People have, and people do. So, and as I said, these sort of islands, the fringing islands, are always fully taken into account. I will just mention one such case, Costa Rica versus Nicaragua from 2018. You can see the slide, Nicaragua, the northern state, Costa Rica on the bottom. And yeah, the red circle is around two small islands. They're located about 1 to 3 miles from the Nicaraguan coast, so even a further distance than Tchelet is. One was a rock, the other a small islet, and the court described them as a cluster of fringe islands and concluded that they must be assimilated to the coast and fully taken into account. And in other words, these islands were given full effect, and you can actually see how it affects the line with the control lines that are marked on the map. And so this is I think, a very close case to the Israeli situation. And the Israeli position accordingly, based on international law, is that Tchelet Islands need to be taken fully into account. Now, it's interesting to note that Lebanon itself has also acknowledged the Tchelet Island and also accepted that it needs to be given weight in the past. In the current negotiation, there has been a change of positions, and they have presented a new line, as Udi mentioned already, and expect Israel not to take Tchelet into account in the limitation of this maritime boundary. Now, in recent months, we've seen in the media that the Lebanese delegation has publicly tried to make the point that Tchelet Island should be disregarded, and this, of course, allows to create new extreme lines. But the fundamental problem with this argument is that it relies in what I would maybe say even in a rather self-serving manner on a few international cases where islands were indeed not taken into account, but this was based mainly on the fact that they were all located extremely far from the relevant mainland coast, sometimes 15, 20, or even 80 miles away. In Tchelet, we talk about half a mile. I've brought you two examples just to substantiate it a little bit. So the first case relates is back from 1981 between two emirates in the UAE. And you can see that the island is circled in red, the Abu Musa Island. It's 34 miles off the coast, so you can see there is absolutely no connection to what I have described as fringing island. The second case, which I wanted to show here, is the in Canada between Nova Scotia and Newfoundland, and relates to the Sable Island, which is even farther away. It's 88 miles off coast. So you can see that it is not in the direction of the coastline. It's not nearby. It cannot. It's just irrelevant when we talk about the Tchelet Island, which is, as I said, about a half a mile off the coast. Now, as a final point, I think Lebanon's position on this issue is even more surprising, to say the least, given that Lebanon itself took into account a couple of islands close to its shore when delimiting its own maritime boundary with Syria. And Cyprus, by the way, as well. So the islands in question, you may have heard of Ramkin. You can see that on this slide here, Ramkin and Nakal. Ramkin is, I think, approximately 10 miles off coast. And you can also see that they are not even in the general direction, but they rather stand out, and they're sort of perpendicular to the coastline. So changing the configuration and changing the general coastline of Lebanon. However, they have fully relied on them. So objecting to taking Tchelet Island fully into account, which you can see here clearly very close to the shore, while giving at the same time, full effect to its own islands in delimiting its maritime boundaries, is, I think, clearly an inconsistent position and hard to defend. So to conclude, I think we've been extensively working on maritime boundaries in past years in the legal office and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and really gained a vast expertise in this field, also with Lebanon and with other neighbors. And I do say that we do that, of course, in an interministerial team. I cannot mention Dana from the Ministry of Justice and Ben from the IDF, who we work very closely together. But as legal advisors, I think at the end our task is to give clear advice as to what international law states, and also to assist the political level in delimiting the boundaries of the dispute and assist in reaching an area of possible agreements based on the legal basis. So though negotiations are not easy, I do believe that with good faith and goodwill, it's possible to reach an agreement in this case. Thank you.
Thank you, Milton. Thank you, Amit. Thank you, Chaim. Just to wrap up, we try to share with you very briefly, really touching really the tip of the iceberg regarding Israeli position in the talks. But as I said first from the beginning, different solutions can be found, but those should be equitable, consistent, and should be found quickly.
Thank you very much, Udi, Chaim, and Amit. So what I'd like us to do now is perhaps zoom out a bit and talk a bit more about the historical and geopolitical context in which these complicated, sometimes very technical talks are taking place. So I want to turn to Dr. Oded Eran. He's a senior fellow here at the INSS. He's a former Israeli ambassador to the EU and to Jordan as well. Oded, you led the first round of negotiations with Lebanon over the maritime border back in 2011 and 2012. So I wonder if you might give us a bit of a historical perspective, perhaps some observations on lessons learned from earlier rounds. How do you assess the current state of negotiations from the historical point of view?
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, the Director General of the Ministry of Energy, and my colleague Chaim, with whom I worked in the first round of negotiations, and Amit, a colleague from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. When we started the negotiations, immediately after the deposition of the Lebanese document in the UN, that is to say, at the end of 2010 and 2011, the negotiations, the pre-negotiations or preparation centered on the following points. Number one was the question, who is going to be the arbitrator? And the decision, the sweeping decision in the Israeli government was that the US is the most trusted go-between, and we turned to the US. One of the reasons was obviously the friendly relations and the trust. And secondly, it was a decision which was led by the refusal to go through the UN, because basically the Lebanese and us, we deposited documents in the UN, but we refused to accept the UN role for two reasons. One is our historical experience with the UN, biased relations, biased decisions by the UN bodies, and secondly, because of what Amit said about the land border, where there was, and still is, the resolution 1701, following the war in 2006. We didn't want the UN to connect the two. We didn't want to be involved in negotiations which would have complicated the ability to reach a settlement on the maritime border. So the US was the chosen arbitrator by us, agreed by Lebanon. There were others in Europe who would have liked to be the negotiators, go between. We had proposals from Cyprus, for example, but the decision was to go with the US. The role of the UN I already alluded to, and there was a clear decision then. I'm speaking about the first round, 2011, 2013. There was a clear decision not to involve the UN. We refused then to have even ceremonial talks at the UN headquarters in Nakura, Rosh Hanikra, the border point between Lebanon and Israel on the Mediterranean coast. Going back to the US role, I think that, as we say in economics, the US had diminishing effective role. That is to say, once they didn't get the Lebanese to agree to the line, all the rounds following that were already marked by the first initial failure to get the Lebanese agreement. Secondly, or thirdly now, the negotiations themselves. As the map Udi Adiri showed you earlier, the Lebanese deposition of the green line created a gap between our position, the Israeli position, and the Lebanese, and the size of this area in dispute is about 850 square kilometers. It is not very, and a very large size, but the potential for finding natural gas is certainly there. From the beginning of the negotiations, 2011, 2013, the Israeli position agreed by the government was that we want to go for a compromise. You can call it equitable, but I would go more than that. It was a compromise that we have agreed that will be equitable minus as far as Israel is concerned. That is to say, we did not rule out the possibility that in the settlement or the compromise, Lebanon will get a larger part of the disputed area. And when the Americans came to Israel with a proposal to divide the area in dispute, the area between the blue and the green line, 850 square kilometers, with a ratio favorable to the Lebanese, there was an agreement in principle which the Americans conveyed to the Lebanese. I repeat, conveyed to the Lebanese. To this very day, we haven't heard an answer to the position on the proposal by the US at the time. And this is, to my mind, the root of the problem to this very day. The Americans continue to believe in all their contacts until, I would say, 2019, that there will be a Lebanese agreement. They continue to talk to the Lebanese on the proposal and never received a final and concrete answer. The fourth or fifth point that we already in the preliminary preparation for the negotiation we discussed is what is called Unitization Agreement. That is to say, once you found natural gas in the area of dispute, which is by agreement divided between the two disputing powers, the question is what happens to the natural resources which are found underneath the water. And the agreement on the dispute, on the line delineation, the line delineating between the two parties is not sufficient, because the most important part is then how do you divide natural gas, which is on the two sides, sort of a bubble which spreads along the dividing line. We did not raise the issue then because there was no need. If you don't have an agreement on the delineation of the disputed area, there's no point complicating the negotiations with the unitization. But I warn everyone, eventually we'll have to get there. The question which, or the partial solution which was already discussed then in our preliminary discussion before we went to the talks, was that maybe companies, outside companies, third party, could negotiate the unitization agreement between them, bring it to the two governments, and the two governments will decide yes or no on this question. I think that given the current situation, a third party is necessary, a third party which is trusted and the two sides have confidence. There is a need to go to the negotiations only when there is an agreement on the principle of delineation. There's no point to go back to the negotiations if you don't agree with the other side on the system of delineation. And I think that basically, this is my personal recommendation, that Israel should go back to, you want to call it the Hof line. Hof was the honest broker. I mean it personally. He was an honest broker at the during the first round of negotiations, to go back to the Hof line, at least in principle, and say to the Lebanese, this was the brokers, the broker we and you accepted. You need to refer to this compromise that was offered by the honest broker. Until we do that, I think that we will go in circles and there probably won't be an agreement. Thank you.
Thank you, Oded. And I'm going to come back to you if we have time at the end and ask you about some of the prospects that you discussed there. But I want to turn first to Sarit Zahavi. She's a lieutenant colonel in reserves and the CEO and founder of ALMA. It's a nonprofit independent research organization and education center specialized in Israel's security challenges along its northern border. Sarit, I actually want to bring you back a bit to where Orna started us off with, looking at dynamics within Lebanon. In your work, of course, you're very focused on Hezbollah. Can you talk to us a little bit more about Hezbollah's interests in where these negotiations might go?
Yes, of course. So first, thank you for having me. I'm honored to be with this very impressive forum. Of course, Lebanon could not go back to the negotiation table with Israel without the confirmation of Hezbollah. Hezbollah in the past at least 2 years gained much more power in the internal arena in Lebanon than it used to, and much more power in the Lebanese government than it used to, also thanks to the fact that actually there is no functioning Lebanese government as of today in Lebanon. The interest of Hezbollah to get these negotiations going and actually solve the problem is first and foremost the economic crisis that Lebanon is experiencing for many years, but especially in the past 2 years since the COVID-19, the blast in Beirut, but it all started even earlier than that. Lebanon needs international economic aid, while the IMF is detaining this aid. Understanding that a lot of part of the budget and the assistance that went to the Lebanese actually went to the hands of Hezbollah. And today there are more obstacles since sanctions were imposed in United States, since in Europe more and more understanding of what Hezbollah is really doing in Lebanon, more designation of Hezbollah in Europe, of the civilian wing of Hezbollah as well. And I think that's why there is much more pressure on Lebanon. The economic crisis is getting deeper and deeper, and Hezbollah understands that the more it is involved in the Lebanese government, the more it takes over the control of this country. It actually needs to progress in this maritime negotiation and to show some prospect of incomes, not only to the Lebanese themselves, but also to the international community in order to get the aid. The fact that Lebanon presented a new line in the current negotiations, it's actually a big question, because if you anticipate, if you estimate that Hezbollah is interested in getting progress while all of a sudden going, backwards to a new line, and this is just an assessment trying to understand. I think that Hezbollah is trying to make sure, and the Lebanese are trying to make sure that there won't be any compromise, that they will get all the 840 or 50 kilometers under dispute. I want to say one word about what will happen to the long range if these negotiations will actually succeed. And here, it's very important to understand where Hezbollah is and where this is heading. First, Hezbollah announced very clearly that it is not going to be involved in the negotiations themselves, but of course, again, in my point of view, they are definitely there behind the scenes. The negotiator on the Lebanese side is the Lebanese president and the Lebanese army, which is subordinate to the Lebanese president. Since Hezbollah is saying very clearly, these are not political negotiations, these are technical negotiations. They are not going to bring any normalization whatsoever with Israel. And to remind everybody, the negotiations started plus minus at the same time when we signed the agreements of normalization with the Arab countries, the UAE and Bahrain. And that's why it was very important to Hezbollah to make it very clear there is no normalization between Israel and Lebanon. These are just technical negotiations. And that's why there wouldn't be any civilian senior figures in these negotiations, just military. If I'm going forward to the future, I just want to say that it's important to take in consideration also the option that Hezbollah will completely take over Lebanon, and where these dividends, these money eventually will go to the hands of Hezbollah, to the hands of the Lebanese, to the hands of what kind of Lebanese government exactly. And that's why it's very important to make sure side by side with continuing the negotiation to make sure that there are some insurances that are being made that the money would not end up in the hands of Hezbollah or in the end up in the hands of Lebanon, which is actually controlled by Hezbollah. I will stop it over here.
Thank you, Sarit. And finally, I'll turn to Asaf Orion. He's a Brigadier General in Reserves. He's a senior fellow here at the INSS, where he directs our China program, among others. In his final posting in the IDF, Asaf was the head of the strategic division of the planning directorate. And in his time in the IDF, he also led the team in the tripartite talks with UNIFIL and the Lebanese Armed Forces. So Asaf, I'd like to ask you if you can offer perhaps a few observations on the military dimensions to any or all of this. Were there any lessons that you took, for example, coming out of those tripartite talks that might be relevant for these maritime negotiations? We've heard repeatedly that there is a desire to separate the dispute over the land border from the maritime border. But then, of course, there's reality, and so I'm curious if you might weigh in on that.
Yeah, good evening, and thank you for inviting. Listening to our speakers, there were a lot of similarities between the maritime talks as we heard them and the talks about delineating the blue line, which began, like marking on the ground. The process began after a firefight in February 2007. And what are those similarities? First, this is a multi-layer negotiation. The teams on both sides are coming quite asymmetrically because the Israeli team comes with a game plan and knows what authorities it has, while the Lebanese usually are more constrained with what they're allowed to decide on the ground. It is, as Sarit said, seemingly a technical discussion, but often you find yourself in, great grandstanding about justice, about history, about who owns it. And even on the blue line talks, Lebanon often tried to divert the discussion into maritime marking, as we hear today. Israel is usually coming in a problem-solving approach. We are trying to find technical and tactical solutions and get things done. Many times our counterparts from the Lebanese side come to have a statement, to have a speech, to speak to the record, to speak to the mediator, to speak to history. So in many aspects, you find yourself in an eternal negotiation when they advance a little and then withdraw with, I would say, self-produced crises, leakage, publicity in Lebanese media. So you find yourself in this Nakura room, which is the extension of Lebanese politics by military, technical, and legal means. I suspect that much of what our colleagues here are meeting is actually reflecting some kind of Lebanese politics. Somebody is appeasing his masters, following the script he's been given, and the dispatchers are probably more important than the proxies in the room. So in many times when you look at things like that, you need to wonder what's on stage and what's backstage, what's really the text and what's the subtext. And often you conclude that, as the joke goes, the Lebanese team doesn't come here really to hunt, but for other entertainments. But still, as Udi correctly said, settling the gas dispute has a huge potential for prosperity, and I would add for security arrangement. But for that, it needs to cross or to traverse this impossible labyrinth of Lebanese politics.
Thank you, Asaf. So in the few minutes that we have remaining, I want to give our speakers just a chance to offer maybe some very brief concluding remarks, partly about some of what they've heard from their fellow speakers here. And if I might ask each of you to think a bit about sort of moving forward now, how do you see the prospects of these negotiations going forward? But I'll go one by one. Orna, let's start with you. Any concluding remarks you want to offer?
Well, I'll have two wrap-up remarks that I think that will lead us to see what's going on in the future. The first one is about the possibility to have some kind of a solution and find some shared agreement about the maritime border. And I think that, as we have seen, the problem is on the Lebanese side because of the dysfunctional system on the Lebanese side. So something has to be changed on the Lebanese side, the position on the Lebanese side, and to allow to have some kind of solution to this problem, because the two countries has interest in having a solution for their interests, economic and others. The second remark that I would like to present is about the international role on this issue. And I think it's very important. It's very important what and how the international community is involved in what's going on in Lebanon. And it seems that nobody cares about what's going on in Lebanon, not so much to try to help Lebanon. So I think that there is a role for the Western countries to come and to help Lebanon. And because the other opportunity, the other possibility is that Lebanon will fall in the hands, will collapse to the arms of Iran and Hezbollah, according to what Sarit was suggesting as a scenario for the future of Lebanon. So there is a real need for Western countries and also the Gulf countries assistance to Lebanon to help to change the situation in Lebanon, and also in the negotiation to find a way to have some agreed agreement between Israel and Lebanon on this issue. Thank you.
I'll maybe turn to our guests on Zoom and let Sarit and Asaf, if you had any other final comments before we close out. Sarit?
So I just want to continue what Orna said. It's not about assistance. I think it's more about supervision, because a lot of money came into Lebanon, but we are not sure where it headed, and it probably didn't end up in the hands of the Lebanese themselves. One more note is about security. I've heard some claims that solving this maritime dispute between Israel and Lebanon, may contribute to the balance of deterrent. If Lebanon/Hezbollah will have something to lose, we are not the only one who will have something to lose. It may be right, but it also may be wrong, because when we are dealing with terrorist organizations, and we've seen this clearly with Hamas in the past few weeks, it's not exactly what they have to lose, it's much more what they have to earn, and they don't truly care about what they may lose. And I'm not sure the fact that the Lebanese will have gas rigs will actually, will be the point that will detain Hezbollah from attacking Israel or deteriorating into all-out war with Israel, assuming that the Iranians will order them to do so.
Asaf, any last comments? I think, Asaf, we're having trouble hearing you for some reason. Try again.
You hear me?
Yes, now we can.
I think that without understanding the politics behind the scenes, it will be impossible to progress on the maritime gas issues. My simple suggestion is to stop thinking about Lebanon as an institution of a state with all cabinet, government, and other artifacts, and to think about it as a group of crime cartels run by families with vested interests. And as much as people are dealing with the narcos conglomerate, they need to deal with people behind the scenes in Lebanon.
Okay, thanks, Asaf. So, Oded, I want to turn to you now and ask, following on comments from earlier, how likely do you think it is that Lebanon will ultimately agree to some sort of resolution here? What are the prospects?
I think that given the experience of the last 12 years of negotiations, the prospects of the Lebanese government eventually becoming to its senses is not very bright. And I think that this is closing very quickly the window of opportunity for the Lebanese. And I think the Director General Udi Adiri mentioned this, that there is a window which is going to be closed by the transition to the green energy, to the urgent need to deal with the effects of fossil energy. And so even if we reach an agreement tomorrow morning, there will be very short time for the Lebanese to exploit economically the natural resources that they have. When we speak about Lebanon, we have to remember that this is a bankrupt state. The first one known in the history to be bankrupt state. And if they cannot come to their senses, it's very difficult for the others. However, I go back to what was mentioned about the international community and its assistance to France. I think that institutions like the International Monetary Fund, which monitors the situation, economic situation in Lebanon, other international organizations, donor states should indicate behind the doors, diplomatically, as they wish, to Lebanon, that a solution of the dispute with Israel is absolutely necessary for the recovery of Lebanon, and they somehow condition the continuation of an assistance to Lebanon on the solution of this dispute. It's not a big price for Lebanon to pay for such a solution. I already indicated the willingness of Israel to be magnanimous in the compromise, and therefore the role of the international community in this respect is very important beyond just mediating the delineation of the disputed area. Thank you.
Udi, perhaps if you'd like on behalf of the delegation to offer some concluding remarks, I'd be especially keen to hear, when you take a step back, how do you assess Israel's interests really in all of this moving forward?
So let's start with some good news. I mean, the very fact is that for 8 months we are negotiating, we have talks with Lebanon. We have direct talks, at least in the sense that both sides sit in the same tent in Akura, present, negotiate under, of course, the umbrella of the American mediators. So I think it's a good news, it's important. Maybe it's unlike what was in 2010 and 2011. Maybe it's the first time it happens for many years. And I think this is positive. By the way, we also don't see this, not regard it as normalization. It's two sides sitting together trying to solve a dispute on the demarcation of the maritime boundary. It's not normalization between the sides. It's nothing to do, also from our perspective, with the relations we have now established with the Emirates and others. But yes, there's two countries sitting together, try to solve problems through negotiation. And I have to tell you all, these are serious talks. I mean, in the sense both sides bring information, bring experts. By the way, the Lebanese delegation is not only the head of delegation is the deputy of the chief of staff of the Army of Lebanon, General Yassin, but the other representatives are also officials and experts, and in that sense, something is happening. I think as Oded said, I think that the ability to reach a solution or to really to move forward depends on the set of mind of the Lebanese, on the decision, strategic decision that have to be made to reach a solution. I think we came to negotiation in order to reach a solution, and I think that it could happen. Regarding our interests, so I think that first of all, from the Israeli perspective, as far as I understand it, and I'm not in the political level, I'm an official in the Ministry of Energy, but as far as I understand, Israel position, Israel interest is always to try and to solve dispute and conflict through negotiations. It's not, it's not coincidence that Israel has established and reached agreements with Jordan regarding maritime boundary, with Egypt in some areas, and in the others we are in full alignment, and with Cyprus. I mean, so in the same sense, we want to have this agreement with Lebanon, and first of all, it serves our interest. The other thing, though it's not proportional between Israel and Lebanon, is we also have the interest to monetize the gas. There is probably gas reservoirs in the disputed area, but it's not only the gas in the disputed area, it also reflects some gas which is outside of the disputed area, and we as Israel have also interest in developing the gas in the disputed area, partially by Israel, partially by Lebanon. But I have to say that in this sense, there is no symmetry. From Lebanon perspective, it's probably much more important because, as we all know, Israel always serves its all energy needs by the natural gas has already been discovered. Israel is already exporting natural gas to Egypt, to Jordan, maybe soon to other countries. But again, also from Israel perspective, it's good to have more gas and to develop it. I think that from the Lebanese side, of course, it's much more significant since Lebanon today need to purchase fuels, to import fuels, much more pollutive fuels than natural gas, much more expensive fuels. So, but it's also interest of Israel, of course. And as I said at the beginning, time is of an essence. I mean, if we wait more and more, I mean, I wish I heard you what you say, Oded, and I think that, if in 2010 or 2013, compromise would have been reached between Israel and Lebanon, and the gas would have been extracted and produced, I mean, it could be just such a bless for the people that nothing that we can do now can compromise the time that has been lost. But at least we can reflect the future and not reflect, we can try to make sure that the future will be better. I want to say that we are here three representatives of the delegation, but it's important for me to say that on behalf of myself and delegation, to thank first of all Minister Steinitz, who is responsible of the issue in the Israeli government. He's appointed me to delegation. He's very closely work with us, and also to thank the IDF, who is part of delegation, the Ministry of Justice, who helps us a lot, the Israel Survey Authority, and the Israel Security Council, which all together collaborating in order to form the Israeli position and delegation. But Chaim wanted to say one last thing, so please, Chaim.
Thank you. I want to clarify one thing. It's not a technical problem. We have concluded that the delimitation agreement with Cyprus during 1 day of negotiations, August 18/2010. During one day, we concluded the delimited line. That's
It's a
all.
matter of a decision.
So if there is a decision, political decision, whatever, yes, we can do it.
Okay,
Good luck.
thank you.
So on that note of, I guess if there's a will, there's a way, we will close out this conference. I just want to thank all of our speakers. I think it's been a very comprehensive, really fantastic set of presentations on a complicated issue. So thank you all for joining us. Thank you all to also our audience here, our live audience, which is a treat after so much time without one. And